Hello and welcome to my C# string handling series. This lesson is Best Methods to Check for Empty Strings in C#. For this lesson, I'm assuming that you are familiar with C# and .NET. The objectives for this lesson are to learn the different methods for checking for empty strings or null in C#, checking for empty strings using the equality operator, use the IsNullOrEmpty method, use the IsNullOrWhiteSpace method, and at the end, I'll talk about the best method to use. Before I show you the IsNullOrEmpty method, we're going to simulate it using equality and the OR operators, so let's take a look. I've created a console application and I've created a single string variable called value. On line 7, I set value equal to null, and then on line 9, I'm going to do a console.writeLine by doing this expression, value equals null or value equals string.empty. So that checks to see what is in that value and is going to return me a true or a false value. Next, on line 11, I'll do value equals quote quote, so that's an empty string. So on line 13, that second part of that expression is going to catch that one and return that as true. Line 15, value equals quote space, quote, there's a space in there. So now both of those values are going to come back as false. And same thing on line 19, when I have some text in there, both of those are going to evaluate to false. So if we run this, we can see we get a true on the null and the empty string, but a false and a false for the space, and of course the value with some text in it. So what I showed you there is really kind of how it works, but it's not exact implementation. So we're going to take a look at the IsNullOrEmpty method, and this is what you should use, because Microsoft says it is better performing than using the equality and the OR operator that I just showed you. Next, on line 29, I'm again setting value equal to null. This time in our console.writeLine on line 31, I'm going to do a string.IsNullOrEmpty passing in that variable value. So this one method here is exactly the same as that expression that I just did, but this one is faster performing. So obviously, the results from each one of these, the value equals quote, the value equals quote space quote, value equals some text, all of these are going to be the same as when I was simulating them. So if we go ahead and run this, we can see that IsNullOrEmpty samples. We have value equals null true, value equals quote quote true, value equals quote space quote false, and value equals some text false. So those now both match. So just like we did before, let's simulate an IsNullOrWhiteSpace method using equality and OR operators just so you can see how it kind of works underneath the hood, and then we'll take a look at this other method. So the IsNullOrWhiteSpace, it really is just checking to see what is in that value variable and checking to see if it's null or an empty string. Okay, so you can see that I set on line 50 value equals to null, and then I do a string.IsNullOrEmpty on that value. So that is going to return a true, so we're done. We get a true back. Line 54, value equals quote quote. Again, string.IsNullOrEmpty value, it's going to say, yep, it's good, so that's going to report out true. But now on line 58, value equals quote space quote. I've got an empty space in there. Now, line 60, string.IsNullOrEmpty, the value is going to be false, as we just saw before. But when we do the OR part, when we do value.trim, it trims that out, and now the length of that value variable is going to be equal to 0, so that returns a true. But then on line 62, when we have some text in there, obviously both sides of that equation are going to fail, and that one will be false. So again, let's go ahead and run this, and now you can see true, 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 and a false. So it doesn't matter how many amount of white space you have in that value variable. If you trim them all out and the length is 0, that means there was only white space in there. Now, once again, we're going to use now the IsNullOrWhiteSpace. Even though we saw how it worked, it isn't really the best to do that kind of expression. It's better to use this one, again, because Microsoft says this one is faster. And if we finish this out now, line 73, value equals null, and then on line 75, string.IsNullOrWhiteSpace on that value. Now this one line here, this string.IsNullOrWhiteSpace, is exactly the same as the expression that we just wrote when we were simulating this. But again, this one's just a little bit faster performing. So we have value equals null, we test that. We have value equals quote, quote, we test that with the string.IsNullOrWhiteSpace. We have the value equals quote, space quote, or again, any amount of spaces in there. And again, when we test it, that will come out true. And then the last one, the value equals some text. So when we run this again, we see the IsNullOrWhiteSpace samples down to the very bottom. And again, it's true, 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 and a false, just like it was when we were simulating the IsNullOrWhiteSpace method. So which method should you use? Well, I always prefer to use the IsNullOrWhiteSpace because obviously it's faster than using your own expression. But the main thing for me is that it ensures that users do not enter spaces just to attempt to get around a required field. So if you're having a user input some data and they see it's a required field and they just get lazy, they might hit a bunch of spaces. Well, if you use IsNullOrEmpty, that's going to succeed. Whereas if you do IsNullOrWhiteSpace, it'll trim those out and make sure that the user can't bypass that required field. Do you know why you should subscribe to YouTube channels? You'll get notifications when new videos appear. You'll get recommendations for related channels. It helps the channel grow, which allows me to create more videos for you. It helps attract others to my channel. Your like helps others find videos that are good. So please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, Paul D. Sheriff. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this lesson on the best methods to check for empty strings in C#.